Let's talk about antique cigar boxes. My journey with cigar box guitars kind of led me down the path where I became interested in the history. From there, I began to collect some of the old instruments and learn a little bit more about the history of actually the cigar box. It's interesting. It's an interesting story. And it's kind of a rabbit trail you can go down. And I'm trying not to go too far down that rabbit trail and get too many of them around here. But sometimes you just can't pass up a really good antique cigar box. Let's look at the history of cigars in the U.S. and cigar boxes. It was actually when Columbus came over, they first saw Indians, the natives, smoking cigars. And from there, it kind of took off. In the 16th century, cigars were actually one of the biggest international trade items. They made them in the U.S. and made them elsewhere and took them to Europe, and they sold lots of them. It wasn't until about the 1860s that it became a little bit more of a commercial product with the commercial regulations. Because prior to the 1860s, they would literally sell cigars in barrels with 5,000 cigars in them. And of course, then as they became more commercialized, then the government got involved, and that kind of changed things. So it was about 1865 that the government started getting involved, and they wanted to tax it. They wanted to say, if you're selling this, we need to find a way to get our share. And so the taxation really began like in the 1860s. It's a big business. It was a big business then. It was the primary tobacco product that was consumed in the U.S. for a very, very long time, and they made a lot of them. The records would indicate that between 1865 and 1965, that 100-year period, there were over 250 billion cigars manufactured. And so what they did is the government began to require them, and they put out laws for taxations. They began to say, no, there are certain limitations on what sizes you can have, the quantity in the box. There were 25, 50, 100, 250, and on up to 500, but they kind of limited. And then you had to buy a tax stamp to sell them. So the government began to get their part of it. During the late 1800s, there were like thousands of brands out there. And they were all making these cigars. Lots of little towns, lots of big towns had a little cigar factory where they would make these cigars. And then because the requirement for boxes, somewhere in their factory or somewhere out back or somewhere in a garage, they would have a little shop that would actually make the boxes because they had to put them in a box. That was a government requirement. And so all of these cigar factories had their own little shops. Some of them would share shops, and there were all these little cigar box factories popping up all over. There's a place here in town. It's one of those old buildings that they built into some loft apartments, and it's called a cigar box loft because it's an old cigar box factory. And supposedly at one time it was the largest cigar box producer in the U.S. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude, back in 1914, a little over 100 years ago, in that year alone they kept record, there were 233 million boxes made in 1914. Well, one of the things that kind of happened is somewhere early on, people began to say, hey, look, if we've got to build a box and we've got to ship it with every cigar box, why don't we make it into a billboard and make it into advertising? This happens to be the Rigoletto, made here in Tampa. So you can see, they said, it makes sense. If we got to make a box, let's put a sign in it, make it a billboard. And interestingly, this older box, it's not real old because the cigars are 20 cents a piece, and that's not real cheap, so that's a little bit later. But basically, the outside of the box is blank, but when you open it up, you can see the billboard. Here's a real interesting fact. I was over talking to one of the local cigar box companies, retailers here recently, and I was talking to somebody, and he just blurted out the fact, I didn't ask him, he kind of said, did you know, Mike, that we believe, his company is one of the largest companies in the world, he said, do you know we believe that 70% of the purchases made of cigars are determined by the box. People come in and they say, well, that's a cool box, must be a cool cigar. So that was kind of a big thing. So you can see that they've gone on to market them. In a future video, I'm going to show you all the modern ones. These are some of the old ones. Here's a great source of information. This is a book. It's called The Handbook of Cigar Boxes. It was written by a guy named Tony Hyman. About 1979 is when the book was published. And he was kind of the world's expert on cigar boxes. And this is the entire history. And so if you want to, you can kind of take a look at this. And he covers the entire story of the cigar box and gives examples and dates and quantities and stuff. And he tells all about it. He had one of the I don't know if he still does, has one of the largest collection of cigar boxes out there. There's a lot of great information in there, and you can learn a lot. And he can also help you begin to date a box. There were some requirements. The government had requirements. A couple of them were you had to put how many cigars were in that box. You had to put the city or the area or the region where that came from and some reference to the manufacturer. Didn't necessarily have to put the manufacturer on there, but you had to have some kind of note on there. For example, this one, it was made by Reed Murdoch and Company out of Chicago, factory number 103. So somewhere there was a list that said this is what factory number 103 was. And it tells you this one is out of the 1st District of the state of Pennsylvania and has the tax notification on it. So it met all the requirements. The other thing that this box has that's really interesting is it actually has the tax stamp on it. And you can see it says it's 50. There's 50 cigar boxes in here. The color means something. And the fact that it's wrapped all the way around 4 sizes would indicate that this is probably from about 1880 to 1890. There's a lot of other boxes that are interesting. It's interesting to note that the factories used all kinds of woods. Today they're kind of specialized on certain woods, but back in the day they'd use whatever wood they had available. And so we see boxes that were made out of oak and redwood and cedar. This one is real interesting. I like this box. We see here, this is a box. It's from famous takeouts from Reese. And it's a big box. This one would actually hold 100 cigars. 100 cigars go in there. Kind of a neat box, long. They're kind of cool. I know this one's interesting because this is a poplar piece of wood on the back. So that's what they had, and that's what they made that one out of. There's other boxes. As they get older, you can kind of see the artwork inside them. A couple of popular ways they would make them is they would make them with nails. This is a nailed-together box. Other boxes would be where they would have a hinge and a nice hasp, and they would have this wood on the inside that's a collar, and it would close up. Really well-built boxes. And so there are a lot of different boxes, a lot of different box constructions that have been around for a very, very long time, and just a really exciting part of the history. And just makes it fun to learn a little bit more about antique cigar boxes. See you in the next video.